Akram, firstly, congratulations on the script. It's truly, I find it, has everybody watched the film, the script, downstairs? I found it enchanting. There's something about it that's very watchable. Now, today is the first time I've actually seen it as it should be. And it's obviously very different when you see a little Vimeo clip of a film and then you see it as installed. It's a very different experience. And I genuinely did find it enchanting. I have two children more or less the same age as this chap, 2 and 5. And I really sympathize for him. He's trying to do his prayers. Anybody that has small children realize it's difficult to do anything, never mind your prayers. But the film itself, I think, is deceptively simple, Akram. It's in 2 parts, as you know. One is set in the Zaatari residence in Saida, and the other is in a theater in Saida. For those of you who don't know where Saida is, it's about 45 kilometers south of Beirut. And it's where you were born, of course. But the film itself, as I said, is very deceptively simple, and I was wondering if you could talk to the audience about the genesis of the film, because it was in fruition, or genesis, for about 2 years, if I understand correctly. And it's not just about film. It is a film, but its obvious reference points may not be overtly obvious to first-time viewers. Could you talk a little bit about how the film came into being, your interest in that specific area?
Thanks for the question, Anthony. The film is entitled The Script, and it is entitled as such because this is a script that is found developed by people who film themselves, YouTubers who film themselves and upload their rushes of themselves on YouTube. So this is not a choreography or a script that I wrote, but I was inspired by it taking place, unfolding on YouTube and being twisted and changed by different people, where you see a man praying. He's not trying to pray because he's, no matter how the kids around him try to interrupt him, he's continuing his prayer. What I like about it is that there's obviously a choreography written for this, so there is a rehearsal. And I was always wondering, why would people do that? I still don't have an answer, but it's amusing and it shows an interesting relationship between father and son, or between grown-up and child. It also shows an interesting relationship between a religious person and an individual that's the kid before knowing religion, because 2 years old, you don't know what religion is. 4 years old, you don't know what religion is. So this ritual is more about, for a child, it's choreography. And the child doesn't understand why, during this particular ritual, the father does not interact. Like, if he tries to catch the attention of the father does not gives him attention. And this is where becomes, like, I think, interesting for people to try to build on it, something that shows a Muslim ritual in the intimate space. There's a few of them set in mosques as well. So you see actually the man praying in a mosque with a child climbing on him. And when I saw this, I thought, like, one day I would like to work on it, and finally the opportunity came up to work on this within a larger installation that addresses people's attitude in front of the camera, namely on YouTube, like in the exhibition Dance to the End of Love. But in this specific case, I do not use the actual rushes. I don't show the viewer the actual rushes. I decided to work on the iconic nature of the film, cinematographically, do it properly with multiple shots, with editing, boosting its iconic nature, let's say.
So effectively, the script itself came from looking at online videos, mostly on YouTube, of men praying with their children. In some of these videos, and you can do a search for them, the child is trying to pray with the father. In others, yes, of course, the child is distracting the father. Can you tell me what brought you to that? Because that's a very specific genre. I mean, it's...
You mean the religious genre, or
I think father and son praying, because that's the search that you used. And to be more specific, that search is made in Arabic. If you make that search in Arabic and in English, you get two very different results, or very different videos. So you made a search in Arabic. Why that specific search, Akram?
Yeah, because well, when I did Dance to the End of Love, I knew that I need to do my search in Arabic to get results coming from the Arab countries, mostly. So therefore, I started researching only in Arabic when I'm researching people's images of themselves in an Arabic context. And Father and Son has to do with another project that I'm doing. I'm interested in representations of father-son, relating to a project about archaeology involving two kings from the Phoenician times, Ishmun-Azar and his his father Tabnit. These are 300, 350 BC. So this brought me into this idea of father and son, and see how they figure in one in one virtual space, like in the space of a photograph or in the space of a film.
Just to be clear, the father and son that Akram's talking about refers to two sarcophagi which were found unearthed in the 18th and 19th century in Saida, where you were born. And these are now have been disinterred. One is in Istanbul and one is in Paris. So they don't actually exist in the same space. But obviously the father and son genre was something that interested you to begin with. You then do the search on YouTube. What you find are not a lot of videos. There's no more than 1,000, maybe 5,000. It's not like millions of videos.
Yeah, no, you don't get millions of videos. But anyway, YouTube has its own mechanism of making sense of what you type. So not all of them would be father and son. Maybe some of them would have father son in the texts or in the comments that are written on. But I mean, in the Arab world, father son has to do with power as well. A lot of kings and their children, a lot of presidents and their children, or prime ministers and their children. Yeah, the political elites has tons of father sons too. But anyway, let's putting this aside, I was I was not surprised, but I was amused by the videos of the men praying with their children, because it involves choreography. That means that the father praying has rehearsed with his son before, and therefore this is a conscious moment where the father wants to project an image of father-son relationship, taking prayer as a chance, as a podium. That involves acrobacies too, because the child needs to rehearse, and without falling it's difficult. So I'm sure the children fell several times until they reached that possibility.
I only noticed today, I don't know if anybody noticed when they were watching the film, but the elder of the two children is just about to run onto the prayer mat, and he stops himself and takes off his shoes, which I didn't realize. But obviously he's being, he's learning. I mean, this is a transfusion of heritage, prayer, faith. But it's also about devotion to his father. There's a very interesting relationship there between the secular and the religious.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you're mentioning it, because, of course, sometimes he would be filming, let's say, okay, 3, 2, 1, go. Now you go to the kid, and then all of a sudden, while climbing, the kid would say out loud, "Oh, I forgot to remove my shoes." Okay. That was like, so he was very conscious of the fact that he kept his shoes or not. Yeah, but that was like just an anecdote, let's say. I didn't mind if he kept his shoes, frankly, but yeah, he was very conscious of it.
I'm just wondering as well, because obviously the form of the film is very different. If you look online for these specific videos, they're handheld camera, there's no editing, it's pretty much one take, it's brief, which is part of the charm, apparently, of YouTube. And I'm just wondering, because you then took that material, which is rough, it's not something that's got a clear narrative even. You then took it, you applied very traditional, I say traditional, filmmaking techniques, which takes it to a completely different level. It gives it narrative, it gives it multiple shots, it gives it multiple edits. You see it from different angles. You, the viewer, have a very different relationship to the act of prayer when it's filmed by a filmmaker as you would if you looked at it on YouTube. So there's a very distinct thing emerging there. And you do it twice. Once it's set in the Zaatari residence in Saida, the other is in the Ishbiliya theater in Saida. Why the two shots? Why the two spaces?
One of them is, for me, a domestic space, and the second one is a performance space. And I wanted to address that slide, let's say, or that displacement between domestic space and performance, highlighting the fact that we are watching a performance, and this is not a spontaneous prayer. This is a prayer as interpreted through the filter of a cinema, of a filmmaker or a cinema. It's going through a cinematic interpretation, let's say. Yeah, hence the two locations. Also two lenses used. We don't use a zoom lens, we use two prime lenses. So one of them is a normal lens or slightly wide angle lens, and one of them is a close-up, and the film is always shifts in between these two angles of vision. One is close and one is slightly set back. But there's also something very, the camera is still a witness here. It doesn't move, it records, and it records from one angle. You don't see them in profile. It's exactly like watching a mannequin in a vitrine. You don't get to see them from the back. The only time when you see them differently is from top, when the father is kneeling on the floor, with the son on his shoulder. And I wanted the camera to stay really outside this bubble. And the only time where you think you might be seeing through the eyes of the father is in the end, when you look at the seats, the empty seats of the cinema. You are already on, you imagine that you are already on stage. You don't see the father and son, but you are already in their previous position, looking at the empty seats. And this is something like this position of a camera is something that I did before in other works, where you see action only from one side.
Something else happens, because obviously, if you do look at these videos online, they're very specific in terms of their location, usually interiors, people's rooms. When you made this film, the script of those individual uploads, you decontextualize it. It's, dare I say, a relatively anonymous interior domestic space, and then it's a relatively anonymous theatrical space. So it takes it out of its geopolitical location, the countries where it was being made, who was making them. Was that conscious, that you wanted to sort of decontextualize the original footage and make it, dare I say, more generic, more universal?
Part of making it, transforming it into an iconic work is actually stripping it from the local nuances, and focusing only on the essence of what this is about. So it becomes like a set of gymnastics that you perform in a competition, for example, where you have to do 3 of that, 4 of that, 2 of this.
And that's with reference to the prayer itself, which is, in Muslim faith, I'm sure most of you know, Salah is 5 prayers a day. It's a very strict sort of routine that you follow. You pointed out to me that the father in this film adds another routine because the kid is enjoying it so much and they're having so much fun. He adds another routine, which is relatively unorthodox. I want to move on, and we'll return to certain things that we've just spoken about there, specifically the notion of excavation. But I want to move on and look at Dance to the End of Love, because this was produced in 2011. I saw it, in fact, in Liverpool in, I think, 2011, 2012. Now, in many ways, this would appear to be the reverse of the script, so to speak, in as much as, and I hope the audience has seen the film, Dance to the End of Love, the installation. Everything's very specific. The footage has not been scripted. It's appropriated, co-opted, lifted directly from the internet. There's no interference. There is subtitles added, but that's only to the song and so forth. Could you talk a little bit about Dance to the End of Love? Because it happens at a very specific time. It's an installation in about 4 different movements, or at least there's 4 distinct movements. You did use YouTube and various online sites to get the information, but you don't do anything to it other than create a collage, or it's much more of a musical score. You represent images against one another, but you don't script it, you don't make a film of it.
Yeah, it's also about juxtaposing attitudes that all of a sudden create patterns when are juxtaposed to similar attitudes. So I always do the analogy with photography as well, because many people pose in the same way in front of the camera. And when you see one alone, it's singled out, you think, okay, wow, Anthony is posing in an interesting way. But when you see that this posture is actually exists with so many others, with thousands, then it's not anymore singular. Then it becomes about an imaginary that has to do with culture, that has to do with iconography, and that has to do with a photographic practice, maybe. It's exactly like you show me a photograph that you received, let's say, from Elton John. A postcard that Elton John sent you, and you're so proud that Elton John wrote to you a very singular line. But you realize actually that he does this with all his, with all the people, with everyone. So when you do an exhibition with the same postcard, repeated over 10 years, then it means something else. So this is, again, becomes about a practice. It tells you something not about the individual, but about the context of the individual, the cultural context. And this is what I'm doing with Dance to the End of Love. I take attitudes and I try to contextualize them with similar attitudes in other places to comment about the imaginary of this society.
And this imaginary is quite an interesting one, because as Akram pointed out there, and we're going to talk a little bit more about Hasham al-Madani's studio, when these photographs, the traditional notion of a photograph, usually it was located within a region or an area. Saida, for example, relatively, well, the second town of Lebanon. But with YouTube videos, you have a dematerialized reality. The geography of that is much more extraneous. It's exploded. It could come from anywhere. And it seems to me with Dance to the End of Love, Akram, that what you have there, and you talk about attitudes, but it's a dematerialized digital reality. It's a community based upon producers becoming consumers of the images that they subsequently produce because they've seen similar images. They create like this echo chamber. Is that part of that?
Let's call it the community. Yes, there is a community of people, and it's an unlike geographic-based communities where you know your neighbor, you compare yourself to your neighbor, and your neighbor compares himself or herself to the third neighbor, etc. And you create a community where traditions circulate and fashions circulate or leak from one house to another. Online communities operate in a similar way. Your friends on Facebook sometimes live in other countries. You know them sometimes, but in so many other times you don't know them, yet you look at what they're doing. Sometimes they inspire you. You remember when was the explosion of selfies all of a sudden? I mean, we all living in the 70s and 80s traveled sometimes alone and turned the camera, the analog camera, and took a picture of ourselves. We never called it selfie, and we were not aware of the community that does this. But all of a sudden, when you call it, you gives it a different, you tag it with something concrete. And it becomes a genre. And becomes, yeah. And all of a sudden, whoever does it belongs to that community.
Because in Dance to the End of Love, obviously, if most of you have watched it, there are a number of genres which are very specific. There's the genre of men doing quite insane looking stunts as far as I'm concerned, tipping cars onto two wheels. There's one guy riding for about 4 kilometers on a motorbike with no helmet. Obviously one trip there and the guy's dead or, you know, paraplegic.
Yeah, many of them do actually die.
I've seen, yes, when unfortunately I went searching for, and there's certain videos on YouTube you don't want to see. Yeah. But I'm just thinking there's very specific genres in that installation, Dance to the End of Love. When you went searching, did you have any specific outcome in mind, or was it a much more opportunistic search? Because with the script, that doesn't seem opportunistic, it's very specific. With Dance to the End of Love, it seems more discursive, less prescriptive, and perhaps a bit more about chance or finding what's there.
I was basing myself on different keywords that I had gathered from studio photography.
Can you remind me of the keywords?
Men flexing, men singing, writing, riding, speed, things like that, that very often you... Like I constructed a thesaurus for the Madani collection. All the different postures, the idea of romance, the idea of masculinity, the idea of family, the kiss, father-son, etc., etc. And I started with these, typing them on YouTube and see what kind of result I would get in moving images. Some of them you would not get anything, but some of them you would realize that they are very actively, still active in the imagination of people. And YouTube has the potential of offering you also other material that is tangentially related to what you're looking for. It's always amusing to get lost on YouTube and look at how crazy people can be sometimes, and how, but also it's about loneliness. I think people spending that much time filming themselves and putting those images online are very often solitary. It's a solitary practice, I would think.
I think that comes across. I don't know whether you guys would agree with me, but it comes across. There's a degree of desperation almost in the videos that are being uploaded. This performance of power, very decontextualized masculine power that has no end in itself. It's not like it's applied power. It's the performance of power. And I think that's fascinating because that's the one thing that runs throughout all of the footage in Dance to the End of Love, the performance of power. Not power per se, but the performativity associated with power. Do you think that that was an element? Because obviously this is about men, ultimately.
In some aspects, yes. In some aspects, it's the performance of power, but that is seeking maximum visibility. You always want to know how many views, how many hits you got. It has to do with being popular as well. Yes, like it's obviously someone who wants to be popular.
And this is interesting because popular, by YouTube standards, doesn't necessarily mean that people interact with you. You're popular because they like your video, whatever you've created. The crazier the stunt, the more people like it. And this is creating quite an interesting, and I want to push this a little bit further, given the world we live in today and what we're learning about social media and the problematic of social media. I think this film is slightly ahead of its time, if I may say, Akram, because Dance to the End of Love, and the script, of course, but Dance to the End of Love in particular, because it isolates a very specific moment in masculinity, and I'm talking specifically about Arab masculinity. It's 2011, I'm sure you guys would remember in 2010, Mohamed Bouazizi, the Tunisian vendor, self-immolates in Sidi Bou Said, which is south of Tunis. Conflagration starts in Tunis. This spreads to Egypt, January 2011. You have Tahrir Square. At this moment in time, there is a crisis, certainly, not just in the Arab world, there's a crisis in Arab masculinity. And it seems to me that that film and the footage that you found, consciously or unconsciously, sort of isolates a degree of crisis, a loneliness, a degree of purposelessness. Where to next? I mean, this continual performance of stunts, this continual, I don't know if you guys remember, some of the characters in it have superpowers, which is a very boyhood fantasy, the idea of having superpower beyond yourself. You can move things with your mind. And it seems to me, Akram, and I don't know whether you were conscious of this or you did it consciously or unconsciously, it's isolating a very specific moment in recent history in the Middle East through that film.
It's very unconscious. I was very unconscious about it, and I did my research in 2010, and the film was like almost finalized in December 2010. The opening was January 2011, and the day of the opening, the revolution in Egypt started.
23rd of January, yes. Interesting.
Yeah.
But you say it was unconscious. I don't think it was unconscious.
Yeah, it's just like when you are very much in close, let's say, contact with the community that you belong to. I think it's inevitable that you absorb a lot of the psychological state, or like your work conveys that psychology of your entourage or your social context. But no, I got to talk about it properly only a few months after that.
Let's think about something else, because obviously the images that came out of the so-called Arab Spring were mostly around conflict. Tahrir Square, Tunis, Yemen, and so forth, Bahrain. Were you conscious when you were making Dance to the End of Love, and even more so the script, of the types of images that come out of the Middle East? And potentially, I don't want to say showing another side to the Middle East, that's too basic, but potentially finding a different way of representing that reality? Potentially. Or is that too reductive?
I think people, it's not that they fight, they compete over producing different realities in an Arab region. And there are multiple realities. Very often they're trying to contradict existing stereotypes. Why is this so? I don't know. It's just like people looking for a singular representation of themselves because they are not satisfied with circulating representations. I don't want to go a lot into the issue of representation because it's a universe. But what I can say is that if each one of us wants to work on multiple representations of oneself, we'll end up with billions and billions and billions of representations, and we will not be able to seize any reality anymore.
On that note, because I did a bit of research, does anybody know how many films are uploaded to YouTube every day? Any idea? Give me a rough figure, guys, a rough figure. 10, 20?
400 every hour.
Sorry?
400 every hour.
400 every hour. Interesting. That's... Oh, from my essay. Excellent. You're cheating. Great. It's actually 400 every second. You didn't read it very well, did you?
Wow, every second.
But it gets better, actually, because I did actually go on YouTube. You can go on YouTube and get all of this information for what it's worth.
And tomorrow's going to be more, and after tomorrow is going to be even more.
Well, the incremental, I don't know if you guys know, but the very first video uploaded to YouTube, I think it's 2005, it's literally a guy standing in a zoo for 19 seconds marveling that elephants have trunks. It's that banal. But now, let me just tell you, 5 billion videos have been uploaded, sorry, 5 billion views a day according to YouTube. 5 billion. That's 5 billion literally looking at particular films. They have 1 billion users. That's a sixth of the world's population are engaged with YouTube. if we want to talk about the production of imagery, the reception of imagery, this is where it's at now. It's no longer around televisual imagery, it's around YouTube. But I want to push on the discussion a little, Akram. I said in Dance to the End of Love, there's the performance of power, that it's not real power. But I don't know if you guys noticed, there is one clip that is very real, and that's a young boy running with a gun. And to all intents and purposes, he's firing a real gun. And it seems to me that that almost preempts.
Oh yeah, Yemen. That's from Yemen.
I was just about to say it's Al Qaeda in Yemen, but effectively, what that little clip. It's only
I don't know if it's Al Qaeda, but I need to go back because back then I did not exactly know the situation in Yemen. But it's a training. It's a training for young adults. Mm. It's a training camp for young adults on arms. And yeah.
I mean, the boy is about 10 years old.
Yeah.
Okay, because this, to me, and again, this is why I said earlier that I think Akram's film, Dance to the End of Love, in many ways is well ahead of itself. When the revolution, the Arab Spring, happens, we had all sorts of nonsense about the Facebook revolution, the Twitter revolution, absolute nonsense. And if you were a shareholder in Facebook, I'm sure you were very pleased to see your market share go up and up and up. But something else happened, of course. ISIS. And ISIS started to use the very networks, the social networks, to spread their particular brand of extremism. And that little clip, Akram, it's only about 20 seconds of the boy running and shooting. It preempts the ISIS videos, and I'm sure you're aware of them if you haven't seen them, of beheadings by young children, which is really quite sort of, I was really taken aback by it today, because I think I'd forgotten that specific. It's the one instance of power being applied in that particular installation. It's real power, it's a gun.
I have a categoric refusal of promoting or circulating any images of violence, frankly. So I did not at all, for example, I always refused to watch any beheadings from the Iraqi, from the times of the Iraqi beheadings until now. So when I did this research, I did not include any of those because I think these are ideologically driven and not individually driven. Now, the fact that this young boy in Yemen, it's really not an it's not contextualized in a certain ideology. It's, I think his uncle or his brother, I didn't know exactly, was filming him because he is singing, actually. Not because he's, it's in the same shot, he sings, and then he runs and, so they're filming him singing, and then they continue and just like have this other side of it's like a bonus,
marksmanship and singing, excellent. I'm going to kind of leave that discussion, and again, folks, please come back to it, of the script and Dance to the End of Love. And I'm going to move on. But before I leave, I think there's other very interesting things that emerged. And when I was researching, and Melanie and I were talking about the film, there was a lot of things I didn't get into my essay. And one of them was in and around ownership, issues of ownership. Who owns what is uploaded to the internet? Now, I think this comes out very forcefully in both of these films, Akram. When you upload an image to the internet or a film to the internet, you no longer own that film. Now, that's an interesting thing in and of itself. And it seems to me that, in a way, what you're playing upon there is the lack of ownership of these specific images, which is the exact opposite of a photograph. Somebody owns a photograph. It's a material object. You own it or a studio owns it. It's physical. You can touch it. You can see it. With Dance to the End of Love and the script, ownership seems to be an issue. Copyright seems to be an issue.
There are two things, ownership and materiality. So ownership and copyrights are something else, different than materiality. If there, about materiality, for example, in analog photography, there is a primary material that's either a negative or an original print. The technology nowadays allows you to reproduce this endlessly, exactly the same, to the 100% the same. Yet, still there is an original, and the original is stored somewhere geographically. It has a weight, it will age, it will change, and when it changes, it's no longer what it used to be.
The photograph, the material photograph.
Photograph or the negative.
Yeah.
It does change. Digitally, it's not the same. The digital image supposedly does not have a weight, does not have it's pixels and it's data. It's data that is stored somewhere, and it's data that can be reproduced endlessly, equally. And it is probably also stored centrally somewhere, but this somewhere is multiplied, so it's maybe somewhere in the United States or duplicated in different places. I don't know exactly how they store, what is storage on the internet, but it goes back to space as well. Yet what is different is that its access is much easier than the original material photograph that exists somewhere with a guardian, with someone who's taking care of it. And I just noticed these differences while working with different archives, physical archives, as opposed to online archives, where things seem to be much more easy, much more liberating also.
So let's discuss this, because this is a core element, I think. Because
yeah, but the issue of rights is something else. Issue of rights is different. YouTube has its own version of Creative Commons that has to do with them, that allows you to use images up to a certain, like as long as it's non-commercial. But I always say, I'm not. I think issue of copyrights are there to regulate the use of images or music or whatever, and not to prevent the use of music. Because as a historian, that I would like to be, I always say it's my right to, like you can write about anything you want, I can include anything I want in my observations that are made on film. And that doesn't mean that I'm using them in the same way as a commercial film. A film is using a tune of music to do a commercial for an advertisement for a telephone or a watch or for anything else. I'm using this material to comment on the society that produces them, to comment on the practices that produce them, and to subscribe this into a larger visual production that has to do with our times. So I am, in a way, a historian of visual culture. I want to be, at least I have this ambition. And I don't want issues of copyright to deprive me from that, because issues of copyright have nothing to do with access. Once I access them, they are already in my work, and I produce work with it. And so I'm not using, I'm studying. This is why I developed this notion of objects of study in relationship to photographs. I like to study visual material, and without having it in my work, I cannot study it.
Let's expand upon that, because I think this is a core point. Akram just said he considers himself to be a historian of visual culture. Now that's a very interesting idea when we move from a material age of photographs, physical objects, to a digital age where you cannot touch, you cannot hold, you cannot literally go open a box and find it. And I want to rewind and go back to 1997. 21 years ago, good grief.
Yeah.
21 years, if I got that right, 21 years? You started an organization that became pivotal for anyone working in the Middle East. The Arab Image Foundation, based in Beirut, was a pivotal organization for understanding not photography, which it collected, but the economy of circulation and distribution around photography as a practice, the apparatus of photography. Could you talk a little bit about the emergence of the Arab Image Foundation, going back to what you said there about being a historian of visual culture, because it's a very specific thing and a very unique thing that occurs in 1997 through to the mid-2000s?
I cannot say I was conscious of it in 1997. It was the time of innocence for me and the colleagues with whom I created the foundation. We were just interested in
promoting photography that comes from the Arab world, and we were trying to put it on the map in the larger context of world photography. So we started looking for practitioners, different kind of practitioners, studio photography, what the others that we called amateurs back then. Nowadays doesn't mean anything, because it's exactly the antecedent of the people that you find on YouTube, or the people that you take pictures and put them on Facebook. I mean, the people that we looked in family albums, we looked at people's travels, we looked at people's weddings, we looked at...
so it's very local, very specific forms of photography?
Cities, yes, yes. And we're trying to discover what was there. And we took samples, we sampled what's out there for the sake of creating this archive with samples. And over time, it took me like 5 years to realize that I'm interested in chronicling what's happened, historicizing, let's say, photographic practices. And, but the fact that this already now exists in an archive makes this idea something else. That's also, it makes it an archive, an existing archive with photographs also. So some people want to see it in archives of photographs. I want to see it an archive of collecting practices. Other people see it a record of social attitudes. It's all of those.
So here's something quite interesting, folks, I think quite interesting. When the Arab Image Foundation is set up originally, its core function, purpose, seemed to have been to collect archives of photographs. Super simple. But then it became something else, something really interesting. It became an archive about archives. It became an archive of collecting practices, as you said. It became an archive of the cameras that were used, the attitudes and the gestures that you could trace. So what was really interesting, depending on what criteria you were applying to the archive, you got totally different results. Very different results, for example, if you're a collector wanting to learn about collecting. Very different results if you're about the visual and you want to collect images of people who have taken a photograph and their shadow is in the photograph, which I think is one series. Very different if you're going into that archive to find images or negatives that have decomposed. That's another criteria which I find, and again, that's the Bodybuilder series is about images that have decomposed. So the Arab Image Foundation, to my mind, Akram, sets an entire agenda that's not about photography, bizarrely. It's about the practice of the archive itself. And that, for me, I think has left a lasting legacy for not just the Middle East, but for anyone working in this field of visual culture today. What does the archive do? How does it order? How does it categorize?
I agree. This is not a question for me, though.
You're not still involved now with the Arab Image
I
Foundation?
am, of
you
course.
Are? Yes.
Yeah,
okay.
of course. I'm not on the board of the Arab Image Foundation this year. Might be in the next few years, I don't know. But yeah, no, I just left the board last year, and I have a lot to do on my own. I need to work on the rest of the Madani collection because I acquired this collection last year, and it's a burden in itself. I need to work on this.
Let's talk about that, because if the audience is not familiar with this, it's quite important that you know about it. So the big breakthrough, I think, for you and the Arab Image Foundation was the Hasham Al-Madani studio, Scheherazade?
Scheherazade. Yeah, Scheherazade is this famous...
Could you talk about how you found that? Because the studio was set up in 1953. I think it closed last year, 2017?
It stayed open until the passing of Hasham Al-Madani less than a year ago.
Can you talk a little bit about that specific studio, the importance of that for your work?
It's one of the, yeah, it's one of the, it's not a unique studio, but it's the only studio of that epoch that stayed open until last year. It's a typical photographic studio that is made with 3 different rooms. It's a large studio where people would go and wait until their turn arrives for them to go into the studio, and because a studio took more than 200 pictures a day, sometimes more, much more, sometimes 500 pictures a day in the 50s and 60s, especially in festive occasions like on
holidays, for example. So that studio exists in the same place from 1953 until 2017 with the entire archive. It's missing a few things that got lost or stolen, but not archives. He got a lot of equipment stolen over the years, but the archives is still intact. And over the years, I transported selections from this archive to the Arab Image Foundation in coordination with Hashim al-Madani, the photographer. Up until 2 years ago, when I had an agreement with him to acquire what remained in his studio and to acquire his copyrights.
Oh, I didn't realize copyright as
yeah.
well. Okay.
So it's a project that means a lot for me, and it's also a life that means a lot to me. But also I would like to have it accessible online to everyone, open. And I would like it to be used as an example of the work of similar studios in the 50s and 60s. Of course, I will continue using this material in shows like today, like what you see downstairs, that would exemplify or sample attitudes or isolate certain occurrences. Really, working on a production that spans over 70 years, like the history of Studio Shahrazad, is actually walking through different stages of photographic practices, seeing how the industry of photography is changing, how different formats are introduced, how people use this platform that is a photographic studio, not only for taking pictures, but for transferring or learning. So it's a place where fashions leak, and it's a place where you go for so many different transactions. Like, you just bought a camera, you don't know how to make it work. You go to the photographer and ask him, can you show me how to work with this camera? So the photographer would teach you how to load film, how to unload film, how to properly expose images. And he wouldn't get anything in return, except that when you develop the film, you are likely to bring it to him. So he wants to have a network of people who depend on the studio to take their own pictures. So it becomes like a place for disseminating knowledge about photography and the culture around photography. Of course, there are always people who hang out there, you don't know what they want. They are probably looking at women. They want some. I mean, it's also like a woman in the 50s in Saida or in Beirut would never go alone to a photographer's place. It's you're more likely to meet thugs there. It's an extension of the street. It's a slightly it's adventurous to go to a photographer. So you would always go accompanied. This is why, for example, this famous story of Mrs. Bakari, whose husband went crazy because he learned that his wife went to the photographer's studio alone, and he came to the photographer wanting the negatives, actually wanting, and they ended up scratching them not to make them useful anymore. So it's risky. It's risky to go to a photographer because it's public. It's a public place.
So if you can imagine that the Shahrazad studio, Hashim Madani's studio in Saida in the 50s and 60s, it's not just an archive of images, it's an archive of attitudes, very specific attitudes. It's also an archive of practices, specific practices based on photography, practice of collecting, practice of making. I'm thinking now, and I think we're going to start wrapping up this part and open it up to questions and so forth. What was interesting for me with the work that you did on Madani's archive, there were two things. There was a project, and you're going to have to help me out here. I meant to ask you before the talk, I totally forgot. You at one point took images that had been, I think they'd been taken by Madani, but then they went into the archive in Beirut. And this is interesting because they're being translocated, disposed, or dispersed, but then you took them back to where they'd originally been shot.
Oh yeah, images of them, copies of them.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this has to do with, I mean, photographs take pictures from somewhere and take them somewhere else. This is one of the essences, or like one of the powers of photography, is that it can show you, it brings the pyramids to London, let's say, via a picture. So photography is like this. I always try to wonder, and sorry, this is why you refer to photographing as taking pictures. Taking pictures is doing the act of photography. Taking your text is this. There's nothing else. I mean, but taking your picture is actually means taking a picture of you, producing a photograph via a camera of you, producing a portrait.
Dislocated from that spot.
Yes, yes. Painting is not referred to as taking a portrait of you. Painting a portrait of you, you'd say painting a portrait, but you would not say, of course you would say photographing someone, but the slang is you take a picture of someone. So I was wondering what returning a picture means, if you want to reverse that act. So I picked a group of 42 photographs that Madani took in the old market of Saida. So this is a project that is interested in identifying the location and the function of each shop that still exists, and negotiate the return of a picture, hanging the picture, a copy of the picture,
where
in
it
the
had
same
originally
shop.
been taken.
Yes, yes.
Sometimes 40 years later.
It is 40, 50 years, 60 years later also. So sometimes it involves negotiation with the shop. But anyway, this is in a way commenting on the taking and untaking of pictures. But also it has another social side, which is it invites people to look at photographs in the same place where they have been taken, as opposed to in an exhibition or an exhibition, exactly. So people were given a map that tells them exactly where the pictures exist, and they would go into the shop, look at the picture, maybe buy something. So it has also some kind of economic, buy a bottle of water, chewing gum, something. Just interact with people in the market as well. So it had to do, it was concerned with bringing consumers of photography or consumers of art into a market that they would normally not go to.
And it seems to me, and we'll finish up shortly, it seems to me that plays a big role in your work. If I may say, I don't think your work on photography is about the image per se. It's about the back end of the image, how the image circulates, how it functions as an economy of production and reception and dissemination, but how the ecology of photography functions, the history of photography, the history of taking images. So the actual substance of the image, what you see, is perhaps the least interesting thing. The more interesting thing is what happens to that object. How does it circulate? Where does it go? How does it disseminate? What other economies does it bring into play? What is it a catalyst for? What does it function for? What moment of exchange happens? Would you agree with that in general terms?
Yes, although I have a special attachment to what Roland Barthes said about photographs, to John Berger, how they looked at photographs, as how they deconstructed photographs through looking at the material recorded onto the picture. But they've done it all. I mean, it's hard to go beyond that. To go beyond that, you need to turn a picture upside down, look at it differently, look at the situation that produced it, talk to the people who are in it, talk to the photographer if the photographer is
Which
there.
you've done in many projects.
Yeah, exactly. To highlight or to add something to what a picture says, you need to go behind it, behind the scenes, and or tell the story of its deterioration. So you need to contradict sometimes the recording and say, I'm not interested in recording. And of course, this is also a Jean-Luc Godard lesson. In order to see, you need to cover your eyes and see differently.
You're talking specifically here about Jean-Luc Godard, which is a filmmaker I'm sure you all know, which has been a big influence on Akram's work, along with people like Rainer Werner Fassbinder, Mohammed Said.
Yeah, sure.
We have been speaking for 1 hour, apparently, which seemed to have went very quickly. I hope it went quite quickly for you guys. But Akram's here. He's very approachable, as you can no doubt make out. Be nice if somebody had some questions or comments or asides. We are open to questions, ladies and gentlemen.
Is there any evidence, or are there any takes between father and daughters on film and so forth? And if no, why wasn't that explored in this particular instant? The other thing is more a broad political front. I think I mentioned to you the other day that Al Jazeera had done some footage of the riots in Australia around the time of the Lebanese diaspora, and also the transfer of male power. I mean, I also picked up that that it was about empowerment. There are aspects of empowerment in the End of Love filming. So there's some interesting links there, or perhaps not. I just want you to comment on those areas. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks for highlighting this. It's very, very difficult to find a lot of images of women in online, because it's, I don't know, it has to do, if it has to do with fear of being slammed or
Trolling.
yeah, it's like women are more careful. It has to do with timidity, maybe, I don't know. But regarding the prayer, I did not see images of girls climbing on... I could have subverted that too, but it would have been making a different film. It would not have been doing the icon, it would have been contradicting the existing circulating relationship, which would have been a different film. But when I was doing the dance piece, I was really looking actively for just like images of women, and back then in 2010, there was literally none. There were, in 2010, the internet in Lebanon was very, very weak, and you could, but 2011, you started to see a lot of people in Lebanon putting films online of themselves. And there you see sometimes women, but from Palestine or from Yemen or Saudi Arabia, forget it, or from the countries that were subject to that research that I did. There were Libya, Yemen, the Emirates, only because these are the countries who had strong internet that allowed uploading. Lebanon was not yet among those countries. The internet is like a public space that is dominated by men's presence. It doesn't mean women are not there. Women are there, but they are not in the foreground of that image.
You know, you've alighted on something interesting, though. Yeah. If you think about Hasham al-Madani's studio as a history of specific attitudes, think about the internet and what you can see on the internet over a period of time as also a history or repository of certain attitudes. For Arab women to upload an image of themselves, unlike for Western women, would be considered, as Akram just pointed out, unorthodox. Now that's an interesting cultural dimension to what is a question of visibility and invisibility. Now, is that changing? Yes, I think it is. If you look, for example, at the whole debate in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia around women driving, that started online with women recording themselves driving and uploading those images.
So, even before they were allowed to.
Literally. So it's a very interesting question because, again, this is about online images are dematerialized, but they still carry a signature. And they carry a signature of the social, political, and economic circumstances out of which they emerge. And I think that's been very common to Akram's work, if I may, Akram, in relation to photography. And it seems now it also can be applied to digital media and digital imagery.
Yeah, I wouldn't say no.
I was wondering if you could talk about humor in your work, because although a lot of your work is about devastating narratives, I think it's also, there's something quite humorous about it. And I'm also wondering if you can talk about relationships with key people in your work, like Hashim al-Madani, and also the characters. Because for me, your practice is a lot about these relationships and narratives that come out of that as well, that accompany the image.
Well, humor, I mean, it's part of me. It's like, it's part of my attitude to things. I like delivering things with latent humor that sometimes is not even noticed. And I think it breaks the heaviness of situations sometimes. Yeah, I cannot say more about it. About relationships, yes, I think the moment you convince an old mother or an old photographer to give you a picture of their children, or to give you a picture of themselves young, then you are already indebted to them in a way. I always felt this in the context of the Arab Image Foundation. This is why my relationship to the archive is not really a neutral one. I know that this picture was taken by X or Y. I mean, I have pictures of women who were veiled when they gave me a picture, but in the picture 30 years ago they are not. So it's, imagine this kind of relationship. This is why I'm saying sometimes I feel indebted to that, because it has to do with trust. And so you live with a lot of documents, but you live with the people who gave you those documents as well. Hashim al-Madani is the most obvious example because I spent with him years. I met him in '99, and I kept on researching in his archive in the beginning monthly, let's say, doing monthly visits to him, sometimes more intensely than others because I made a film about him and his work and about the studio. So we spent a lot of time together, and we have addressed a lot of questions that normally I would not address with people that I see once or twice. So so this is all to say that there are many people that navigate your universe. Hashim al-Madani is one of them, Van Leo is one of them, the historian Jibril Jabour is one of them, the anthropologist Ahmad al-Batrawi from Egypt is one of them, even though I never worked on his work before, but I have collected his images from his daughter, and it's someone who really stands out. People who did very specific things in the history of their countries, but that stand out in their dedication or their audacity or their humor or their love to photography. That's also something very important. Like, why am I interested in the writer the historian Jibril Jabour is because of his passion to photography, and because photography for him was a tool that accompanied his studies and his work and his categorization of the Bedouins in the Syrian desert. Ahmad al-Batrawi is the same. He was responsible for doing the relevé of the situation when the government in Egypt wanted to build a new dam in Aswan, before the famous Aswan dam. They had a smaller dam that they wanted to redo. That means the water would cover a lot of areas that were formerly uncovered. And as an anthropologist and as ethnographer and a scientist, he was sent there to do that relevé. And all of these are fascinating. We're talking about the 20s. We're talking about Aziza Galal, for example, who is a woman who drove in Egypt in the 30s, who removed the veil early, who was a housewife. She didn't do anything else, but that's important. And for me, most importantly, I'm talking about the archive of people who I met in the 90s and who are not there anymore. Nabiha Lotfi, the first woman who studied film in the Arab world in Cairo. She's also from Saida. And who loved photography and who exists in this, who has an orbit, let's say, in the universe that I constructed only because of her relationship to photography. What's his name? The novelist and the doctor from Raqqa, what's his name? It will get to me like...
Contemporary novelist?
Yes, he died in 2002. He's not very known. He's from Syria. He's but quite specific. He was passionate for photography, and he bought a camera in 1948 before he went, he joined the Liberation Army in Palestine. Mm-hmm. He went there for 6 months. He was also a member of the Syrian parliament. What's his name? It will come, Dr.
But obviously with all of these...
Yeah, it's like these are like, for me, amazing experiences. Like, how can you write about the Arab world without knowing ordinary people like those, who are only, who become visible to me only because I'm interested in photographs, and therefore I'm looking for people who practiced photography at home in a small scale, not necessarily open a studio, and you, and all of a sudden is uncovered in front of you a whole universe. You feel privileged because even though the images are today in an archive like the Arab Image Foundation, but they are only threads. I was privileged to meet those people, sometimes interview them, get a feel of who they are, and get their trust. That's, yeah.
Do you mind me asking, why did you ask on humor specifically? Are you researching it, or is it something that interests you in general?
No, well, I was researching Akram's work, but I laughed when I was downstairs watching the film, watching Dance Till the End of Love. And it's the first time that occurred to me that there's a pattern of humor in the work.
Yeah.
And I just really...
I think you're right. And
yeah, that's true. There is humor in most of my works.
I was thinking about, do you know Another Resolution? The series where Akram asked adults to pose as children. Has anybody seen this? I think this is very funny because I know quite a few of the people in it. And this is Lara Baladi, an old friend. And I've just been talking to Lara. This is Lara, age, she'd be in her 30s in this photo, posing as a 4-year-old child eating an ice cream. Every time I see that image, I laugh out loud. I think it's one of the funniest images I've ever seen. If you know Lara, it's even funnier. But there is...
Yeah, that's to do with social formatting, let's say, and the discipline of a grown-up. You lose a lot of spontaneity, unfortunately.
And again, it becomes about gesture and about attitudes, which I think a lot of Akram's work is about. Recording attitudes and looking at gestures. The script is about gesture if it's about anything. I think this gentleman had a question.
Hi, thanks for a great discussion. Really enjoyed it. I wanted to ask, and it follows on quite nice from the question just now, and that is that in your role as a, in what you've talked about today as a historian, as an archivist, as a collector, or as a documentarian, there's a kind of a relationship to the image or the work that you do that it's slightly detached. It is at the service of the photograph as a document and of its history and of its circulation. And I'm interested in perhaps what your relationship to that practice is from a subjective point of view, because when you show your work within the context of art, there are a set of like aesthetic, maybe emotional, maybe personal connections that you have with that content, and then that has to be translated into the plane of presentation. So I want to know how strong that aspect of your work is for you, or whether you let the image or the site in which the work is shown make those decisions for you.
Yeah, it's, thanks. It's always a negotiation. It's a negotiation of both. They need to exist. I feel an obligation or a responsibility vis-à-vis a document, vis-à-vis its history, vis-à-vis the practices that produced it. But at the same time, I make this go through a process of rendering, let's say, that is informed by, I'm a visual artist, that is informed by my documentary background, by my visual art background, and therefore I cannot just take an image from the street and put it in a gallery. I need to make it go through a process, almost recreating it. Like what I do with this, with the script, with the film that is the script, I recreate it. This is emblematic, maybe, of what I do with images of Hashim al-Madani, because I do recreate them, even though I show them as is, but I recreate them because I create the theater that allows them to exist with their baggage. They exist still, at the same time, subscribed to the practices that produce them. And this is, in a way, essential. This is part of my, I think, documentary responsibility, let's say. That I don't allow myself to produce fiction out of something that I know well. I cannot take a picture of Anthony, say this is X or Y that is not Anthony. If I find a picture that I do not, the subject of which I do not know, then I can allow myself to create or to go wild in imagining what this is. But I feel responsible when I know the story.
There are always some limits in terms of not going completely.
Yeah, but they are not equations. I mean, I measure. Sometimes I allow myself to go beyond. Like, for example, with the archive of Hashim al-Madani, this is an archive that is not necessarily public, because these people did not want their picture, I don't know if they want or not to have their pictures in public. It's not like YouTube. On YouTube, if I find your picture on YouTube, that means you want it to be on YouTube. But who says that someone who went to a photographic studio in the 50s are not in a position to imagine what would happen to their image 70 years later? They never thought that their image might exist in public. I allowed myself, because of my interest in the photographic record, because of my interest in history, I cannot have an opinion about a photograph without showing it. So I took decisions that there are pictures that I would show. I took decisions that are pictures that I would not show. I leave this to myself. So I need to decide. Of course, there are certain images in the Hashim al-Madani archive I cannot show. And this is why I did not address them yet. But I could devise a way to address them in the future without showing them. I don't know.
But you've alighted upon something very important here, and I think Akram's teased it out, and it's a big distinction between the digital image and the material image. The material image, when it was taken, say in Saida in 1940, 1950, it had a very specific location, and the people that were in that image did not tacitly agree on any circumstances for that image to go outside of the studio or the house.
Now, as soon as you upload to YouTube, there is already a tacit agreement that anyone can look at that image. But something even more profound, anyone can co-opt that image, manipulate that image, and redistribute that image. That's a whole other level of engagement. And the same thing applies, rather bizarrely, to your Facebook account. And very briefly, I have a question for you guys. How many people are not on Facebook here? Hands up. 3 people are not on Facebook. So the rest of you have all read the terms and conditions of Facebook.
No. Of course.
You've read the
there are 100 pages.
document, yes, which they're working hard to simplify. But if you have read it, you'll come up with this, one sentence only. Facebook has a license to use your content in any way it sees fit, with a license that goes beyond merely covering the operation of its service in its current form and any future form that it may take. They not only own your image as soon as you upload it to Facebook, they own any future copyright of how it will be used in forms and technologies that have yet to be invented. That's extraordinary. When you sign up to Facebook, you not only sign up all your images, you sign off the future of those images. That's, for me, mind-blowing. And that's what the digital opens up, a whole new relationship to images themselves. There's a lady
If
at the
I've
back.
understood you right, I think it kind of builds on other questions asked. And I think you mentioned a really vast number of photographs that one would need to take to capture something of oneself. Did I understand that right? It worries me a little because I'm embarking on a project, a research project, where I'm hoping to try and find a little more about the lived experience of girls aged between 12 and 17.
Girls between the age of 12 and 17. Now.
Right now,
nowadays.
yeah.
Online? Through online?
No, in person. And then I'd like to talk to them about what they've taken and why they've taken it. Yeah. But I'm only asking them, I'm going to ask, if I can, that they take 5 photographs and talk about 5 images.
Of themselves?
Of themselves. And or their experience, their walk to school or their shoes or whatever.
Here but in the UK?
Yeah.
Arab? No.
Sorry?
Are you talking about Arab subjects?
I'm talking about actually any minority subject.
Oh,
so yeah, it can be Asian, Black, or Arab, or Chinese, or you know, any. And I'm wondering now, do you think 5 will do it?
Why are you limiting it to 5? Maybe just.
I just because I want to talk about what comes back.
Still images or
stills?
Yeah, interesting. Maybe, I mean, the number is not important for me because they can take 10 and you choose 5, or with them you make a choice, but limit, yeah, I mean, I mean, this is your project, so yeah. You'll realize that whatever you decide will have an implication on the final product.
So you'd be more generous?
Yeah, because nowadays, if I go somewhere, I take at least 20 images, like in half an hour.
Yeah.
So 5 is...
It's mean.
What?
No, 5 is a mean number.
Yeah.
So I should be more generous.
Yeah, or at least ask them to bring 20 and you select with them 5.
And maybe prioritize, like rank order.
Yeah, also.
Are they going to be digital images?
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. You could say to them, take 10,000 digital images, but if you gave them an actual analog camera, 5 physical images would be quite interesting because that takes a lot of effort.
It takes a lot of curating then, you mean?
Well, it takes a lot of effort to go and print out those images unless you develop them in your bathroom at home, which I used to do and I'm sure you used to do. I mean, to take a physical image, an actual image, and put it on a table like a material image, that's a big deal these days.
That's a big deal, yeah.
With all the images even on our phones, I don't know the last time I actually downloaded any of those images into a physical image that I have on the wall, maybe one out of every.
I mean, this is an interesting, because the limitation is also like a roll is 36, of 35 millimeters is 36 images, so if you give them a roll, they are confined to this. Or if you give them a Polaroid pack, which is interesting as well, because it means 10 images, and if one of them fails, that means there are 9. If 2 of them fail, that means there are 8. So they will need to think twice before taking an image, as opposed to just keep on clicking,
yeah.
and looking at the end result and make a selection.
You might want to look at, there's a project by an artist actually that Akram has worked with, Yasmin Aid Sebag. She put this fantastic project. I think, again, Yasmin's light years ahead of her time. She worked in Al-Shadarat refugee camp, where she gave cameras to refugees, Palestinian refugees, to take photographs of their everyday life, but then refused to show any of the photographs so that they didn't get engaged in this economy of victimhood. So she got them to take the photographs, and then she spent 10 years not showing the photographs, which I think is profound in many ways. And I think Yasmin, again, explores the political economy of photography, just as Akram does, which is not about the image per se. It's about what happens to the image after the moment of its taking. And I think Akram teased out that notion of taking very clearly earlier.
And I hope to talk before and after the images, so the image will be a source material that I may or may not share, and the copyright will rest with the girls themselves. So it won't be mine to share, in a sense, although they may agree that I
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, yes, Yasmin, like more than this, also she spent more than 5 years with them.
Yeah,
she accompanied them over 5 years, and sometimes did exhibitions with these works.
In the camp?
And outside the camp.
Ah, right,
yeah.
okay, yes.
But what she did not show is the social, like she collected a lot of photographs from their families and from different families in the camp, and that's what's really interesting, is that she always refused to show these. She describes them, or she built performances where she performs them, but she does not show them.
I think this is fascinating.
This
and again,
is fascinating. It's an amazing project.
Today, when we're living through the biggest humanitarian crises that the world has seen since the Second World War, and we seem to be living through the alibi of taking photographs of refugees and showing them, Ai Weiwei very infamously rehearsing and reperforming the death of Alan Kurdi on Lesbos. I mean, shocking in and of itself. But the whole media seem complicit in this, as if images of refugees is going to change political policy, which it isn't. Now, not showing those images, the refusal to show, again, to consider the political economy which images circulate, as Akram's work does, as Yasmin's work does, is much more important for me personally as somebody writing about this, as a historian and so forth. So maybe that's one context you might want to consider. I think we have to end. I can see Melanie looking at me. We have time for one final, very super brief.
Indirectly. Sorry, yeah. In a way, you touch upon indirectly. It's really important. It's to do with the physical political dimension, particularly in relation to the script. Is it one way of portraying the soft power in the Muslim faith as in relation to, or could it be seen as that, in the way that you shot it, in relation to us, the West, viewing it? You know, I think in terms of the jihadi films, particularly as well, in parentheses, if you like, with what happened downstairs, there seem to be implied, or perhaps suggested, or maybe not consciously put views in terms of a wider political perspective in terms of the debate now, because what's happening here is that I hear again, over and over again, of the requirement that Muslims show that they're against jihadis. They have to demonstrate somehow that they really are against these people killing people. Why should they have to demonstrate is the question, because Christians don't have to demonstrate that, do they? So anyway, that opens up a whole debate, and it seems to be indicated in the way the film was shot, both from the front, the kneeling positions, and the back. And also, you often get a lot of jihadi films that use similar types of shots in their build-up to putting across a political message of violence. Just an idea. Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, again, I mean, there's it's not a question. It's a sound observation. The film is not about Islam. The film is about an intimate moment between a father and a son. It just happened that it's set around the practice or a ritual that is practiced by Muslims. Yeah. Yeah.
But you've opened up a whole other area,
yeah,
which is fascinating. Has anybody ever seen ISIS's magazine? You know they produce a magazine. It's a monthly magazine. It's like a monthly magazine that you can buy, and it's circulated to all the ISIS people. And these guys know how to use Photoshop, which is scary. not only Photoshop, they're with technological means, they are aesthetically as conscious as any other magazine I've seen. You can download it online. I'm not going to give you the website. I'll probably get arrested. But it's there. Type in ISIS magazine. Actually, don't do that. The government will come and get you. Folks, I'd like to thank Akram and certainly thank you guys for your questions. That was a fascinating discussion. Akram, congratulations again on the show. And Melanie, congratulations. It's genuinely a wonderful show.
Thank you, Melanie, for this beautiful show. And everyone at NEA.